town of Brindle was the kind of place that seemed to slip through time, untouched by the rush of the outside world. Nestled between sprawling woods and a winding river, it was a quiet, unassuming town where the most thrilling events were the yearly fairs and the changing of the seasons. But recently, something had shifted. A shadow had crept over the town, and no one wanted to talk about it. Ellie Langley stared at the town's welcome sign as she drove past, her eyes following the jagged lettering beneath it. Where dreams are born. It felt oddly ironic now, considering why she was there. She had been sent by the magazine she worked for, Night Terrors, a publication that thrived on the strange and the unexplained. Rumors of shared nightmares had been circulating online, stories of people waking up screaming, or worse, not waking up at all. The tales were vague, but the fear was real. No one knew where these whispers had started, but Ellie was determined to find out. And it had led her here. Brindle was small, almost too small. It felt as if the town had been frozen in time. The streets lined with old Victorian-style houses and empty storefronts. There was something unsettling about its stillness, like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. She pulled up to the local diner, Mary's Place, its neon sign flickering like a heartbeat in the dusk. The bell above the door tinkled as she stepped inside. The smell of coffee and grilled bacon greeted her, but so did the silence. The few patrons in the diner glanced at her, then quickly looked away, as if they knew who she was, or worse, what she was there for. "Evening," Ellie said, offering a smile to the woman behind the counter. The woman, older with lines etched deep into her face, gave a tight nod. "What can I get you?" Her voice was flat, tired. "A coffee to start," Ellie said, sliding onto a stool. "I'm here writing a piece on the town. Heard some strange things have been happening lately." The woman stiffened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What kind of strange things?" "People having nightmares. The same ones from what I've heard. Thought it might be a good story." Ellie kept her tone light, but the woman's face turned to stone. "There's no story here. People dream, that's all." The woman poured the coffee, but her hand shook slightly. Ellie didn't push. She took the coffee with a quiet nod and sipped it, the warmth spreading through her chest. She glanced around the diner, noticing the other patrons had gone quiet, their eyes flickering nervously toward her. A young man in a corner booth looked especially uneasy, his hands gripping the table so tightly his knuckles were white. Something wasn't right. Ellie set her cup down and stood, heading toward the man. He didn't notice her at first, his eyes distant, as if he were seeing something no one else could. "Hey," she said softly, sliding into the booth across from him. He startled, his wide eyes locking onto hers. "You're not from here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," she replied. "I'm a writer. Just wanted to ask a few questions about what's been happening." He shook his head quickly, his breathing quickening. "You shouldn't have come. No one talks about it. If you talk about it, it finds you." "What finds you?" Ellie asked, leaning forward. Her pulse quickened, a chill creeping up her spine. "The Night Stalker," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting something to burst through. "It comes when you sleep. It hunts you in your dreams. And if it finds you..." His voice faltered, trembling. Ellie felt the weight of his words settle heavily in her chest. She had heard similar phrases before in passing whispers online, but seeing the terror etched into his face was different. Real. "What happens if it finds you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the table. "You don't wake up." The air in the diner felt colder now, heavier. Ellie glanced around again, but the few remaining patrons were gone. The diner was almost empty. The only sounds the hum of the old refrigerator and the faint buzz of the neon sign outside. Ellie knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary dream. Something far darker was at play here, and whatever it was only just beginning. The next morning, Ellie stepped out of the small motel she had rented for her stay. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wet earth, but it did little to ease the unease gnawing at her gut. Brindle looked peaceful enough in the daylight, but it was a fragile illusion. Last night's conversation with the young man still echoed in her mind. The Night Stalker. It hunts you in your dreams. It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie, but there had been nothing theatrical about the fear in his eyes. Ellie's next stop was the town library, a towering relic that stood at the edge of the square, its ivy-covered brick facade blending with the rest of the town's antique charm. Inside, the heavy scent of aging books and polished wood greeted her, and the silence was almost oppressive, thick, and watchful. She made her way to the reference desk where a bespectacled older woman sat, her hair pulled into a tight bun. The woman glanced up as Ellie approached, her gaze lingering just a bit too long before she spoke. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for any historical records about the town," Ellie said, trying to keep her voice casual. "Anything unusual that might have happened here. Legends, folklore, things like that." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. "You're the reporter staying at the motel, aren't you?" Ellie hesitated. "Yes, just here for a few days. Thought I'd dig into the town's history for a piece I'm writing." The librarian pursed her lips, then leaned in slightly. "If I were you, I'd be careful what I dig up." Her voice was low, a warning. Some things are better left forgotten. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. "Why do you say that?" The woman didn't answer right away. She glanced around as if making sure they were alone, then spoke softly. "Brindle has its stories. There are old superstitions about things that lurk in the night, things that prey on the weak when they're most vulnerable. My mother used to tell me tales of it, the one that comes when you close your eyes." Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed a stack of books toward Ellie. They called it the Night Stalker. Ellie felt a chill run through her. "How long has this legend been around?" The librarian sighed. "Too long. I don't know how it started, but there have always been whispers about a creature that haunts people in their sleep. Some folks think it's a curse tied to this place. Others think it's just a story to scare children." Her gaze darkened. "But those who've lived here long enough know it's more than just a story." Ellie flipped through the books, finding references to strange disappearances over the years. People who went to bed and simply never woke up. The records were sparse, but there was a pattern. Every few decades, Brindle seemed to suffer a wave of unexplained deaths. No autopsies, no signs of struggle, just an empty shell left behind. As if the person's soul had been ripped from their body while they slept. "There's no official documentation," the librarian said quietly. "The town doesn't like to acknowledge it. They'd rather pretend it doesn't happen. But anyone who's lived here long enough knows the truth, and those who dare speak of it." She trailed off, her voice barely a whisper now. "They become its next victim." Ellie's skin prickled. "You're saying talking about the Night Stalker draws it to you," the woman finished, her expression grave. "It feeds on fear. The more you talk about it, the closer it comes. And once it finds you..." She pressed her lips into a thin line. "There's no escaping it." Ellie felt a knot tighten in her chest. She had come here looking for a story, but she was starting to realize she might be in over her head. She spent hours in the library, poring over the town's scant records. The older files contained no outright mention of the Night Stalker, but the pattern of deaths and disappearances persisted. Each incident was described the same way, peaceful on the surface, but with an undercurrent of deep, inexplicable dread. The victims were always found in their beds, their expressions frozen in terror. As the sun began to set outside the library's tall windows, Ellie felt the weight of the town's silence closing in on her. The librarian was right. This was more than a story. Whatever haunted Brindle wasn't just a legend, and Ellie had the sinking feeling that by coming here, she had already attracted its attention. She left the library with a sense of urgency, her footsteps quickening as the shadows lengthened on the cobbled streets. The quiet, watching eyes of the townspeople followed her as she passed, and the air felt thicker with each step. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something, unseen but very real, was already lurking just beyond her reach, waiting for the moment she closed her eyes. That night, Ellie's sleep was uneasy. She tossed and turned in the motel's creaky bed, the thin sheets tangled around her legs. The room was suffocatingly still, as if even the air had become too afraid to move. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside, silence pressed against her ears. When sleep finally came, it didn't come gently. Ellie found herself standing in an unfamiliar hallway, the walls dark and narrow, as though the space itself was squeezing in on her. The floor beneath her feet creaked ominously with each step, the sound echoing unnaturally, as if it was being swallowed by something vast and empty. She didn't recognize the place, but a part of her, the deep, instinctual part, knew it wasn't safe. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something rotting. Her breath quickened, coming in shallow gasps as she glanced around. The walls stretched endlessly in both directions, and dim, flickering light bulbs hung from the ceiling at irregular intervals. She felt disoriented, unsure of where she was or how she had gotten here. But more than anything, she felt watched. There was something in the shadows. She could feel it. A presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for her to notice it. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being hunted. She tried to focus, to get her bearings, but every direction looked the same. Long, endless corridors that seemed to shift the moment she looked away, twisting into different angles. No matter where she turned, it felt like the walls were subtly bending, rearranging themselves, trapping her. Ellie forced herself to breathe slowly, trying to remain calm. It's just a dream, she told herself, though her heart was hammering in her chest. But it didn't feel like a dream. The sharpness of the cold air, the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, it all felt too real, too vivid. And then she heard it. A faint, dragging sound from somewhere behind her. Something was moving in the darkness, slow and deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. Ellie froze. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was getting closer. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow and fast as she turned her head slowly, almost too afraid to look. At the end of the hallway, far beyond the reach of the flickering lights, something shifted in the shadows. She couldn't make out a shape, only a sense of movement, something large and unsettlingly fluid. It slithered, its form twisting unnaturally, as though its body didn't obey the same rules of movement as anything she had ever known. She took a step back, her feet stumbling over themselves as she moved. The thing in the shadows paused for a moment, as if sensing her fear, and then it surged forward, the sound of dragging becoming a horrible, wet, scraping noise that made her skin crawl. Ellie turned and ran, Her footsteps pounded down the endless hallway, but no matter how fast she ran, the corridor stretched on before her. The lights flickered violently overhead, casting jagged, shifting shadows that danced along the walls. Behind her, the scraping grew louder, closer, the thing gaining on her with an awful inevitability. She couldn't breathe. Her chest was tight, her throat constricting as panic clawed at her. The hallway seemed to be closing in, the walls narrowing with every step, but still, she ran. Her only thought was to escape. Escape the thing chasing her, the thing she couldn't see but could feel in every fiber of her being. And then, without warning, the floor gave way beneath her. Ellie plummeted into darkness, her body weightless and spinning as she fell. Her scream echoed through the void, but the sound was swallowed up by the oppressive blackness that surrounded her. She tumbled through the air, her limbs flailing uselessly until she landed with a jolt. Ellie shot upright in bed, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart slamming against her ribs. The motel room was dim, the curtains fluttering softly in the breeze from the cracked window. But the air was thick with something she couldn't name. Something wrong. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone on the nightstand, the dim glow of the screen illuminating the dark room. It was 3:13 a.m. She wiped the sweat from her brow and tried to calm her racing heart. It had just been a dream. Just a dream, she told herself. But it felt like a hollow reassurance. The lingering sensation of being hunted still clung to her, like an invisible hand resting on her shoulder. She could still hear the faint scraping sound in the back of her mind. Ellie shuddered, trying to shake the fear from her bones. She didn't want to sleep again. Not tonight. Not after that. Something was waiting for her. She could feel it, just beyond the edge of consciousness. And she knew it was only the beginning. The morning light did little to chase away the dread that had settled over Ellie. She sat at the small table in the motel room, her coffee growing cold as she stared blankly out the window. Her mind was still reeling from the dream, or whatever it had been. It felt more like a warning, a twisted glimpse into something she wasn't meant to see. The scraping sound, the feeling of being watched. It was all too real, too vivid to be dismissed as a mere nightmare. She picked up her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing the number for Dr. Arthur Fielding, the dream psychologist she had found in her research. His name had come up in connection with other reports of shared nightmares, and she had hoped to interview him while she was in Brindle. Now, after last night, she needed answers more than ever. Dr. Fielding, a gruff voice answered on the other end. Dr. Fielding, my name is Ellie Langley. I'm a journalist investigating the strange occurrences in Brindle. I've heard about your work on shared dreams and Ah, yes, Miss Langley. He cut her off, his tone softening. I've been expecting your call. I understand you're looking into the Night Stalker. Ellie's blood ran cold at how easily he spoke the name. You know about it? There was a pause on the line, the static buzzing faintly in her ear. More than I'd like to, I'm afraid. You've already seen it, haven't you? In your dreams. Ellie swallowed hard. Yes, last night. Then we don't have much time, Fielding said, his voice tight with urgency. Meet me at my office in an hour. I can explain everything, but I must warn you. Once the Stalker has touched your dreams, it doesn't stop. The line went dead. Ellie sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She had expected answers, but not like this. Fielding spoke with a certainty that unnerved her, as though he had seen the Stalker before, perhaps too many times. The drive to Dr. Fielding's office felt longer than it should have. The streets of Brindle were eerily quiet, the few people she saw moving quickly, heads down as though they knew better than to linger outside. The sun shone brightly, but it did nothing to lift the oppressive weight that hung over the town, a heaviness that seemed to thrum in the air, unnoticed by all but those who knew the truth. Fielding's office was tucked into the back of an old, run-down building on the outskirts of town. It was a modest space, cluttered with books and stacks of papers that teetered precariously on every surface. The walls were covered in strange, abstract paintings, twisting shapes and shadowy figures that seemed to writhe and shift in the corners of her vision. Fielding himself was a tall, thin man with deep-set eyes and a gaunt face that looked like it had seen too many sleepless nights. He gestured for Ellie to sit, his fingers trembling slightly as he poured her a glass of water. "I'm afraid there's no easy way to explain this," he began, sitting across from her. "The Night Stalker isn't just some figment of the imagination. It's an ancient entity, something that exists outside the boundaries of our waking world. It thrives on fear, on the terror it plants in your mind when you sleep." Ellie frowned, her fingers tightening around the glass. "How does it get inside your dreams?" Fielding sighed, rubbing a hand over his weary face. "It's drawn to those who know about it. The more you speak of it, the more you think of it, the stronger its hold becomes. It slips into your subconscious, where you're most vulnerable. Dreams, after all, are where our deepest fears live. The Stalker feeds on that fear, and once it has its hooks in you, it doesn't let go." Ellie felt a chill crawl up her spine. "But why Brindle? Why is it here?" "It's been here for generations," Fielding said, his voice lowering. "The town is cursed in a way. Some believe that long ago, a coven of witches summoned the Night Stalker to exact revenge on those who wronged them. Others think it's tied to the land itself, something darker that was here long before Brindle was built. Whatever the cause, the Stalker has been here for centuries, feeding on the town's fear, taking those who dream of it." Ellie's heart raced. Is there any way to stop it? To break the cycle? Fielding's expression darkened. "There's no way to stop it entirely, but you can weaken it, make it retreat, at least for a time. You have to confront it in your dreams, face it head on. But that's easier said than done. The Stalker knows your deepest fears, and it will use them against you." Ellie's mind spun. Confront the Night Stalker in her dreams? It sounded impossible, but if there was even a chance of stopping it, she had to try. "How do I fight something like that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Fielding leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "By refusing to give it power. The Stalker feeds on fear. The more afraid you are, the stronger it becomes. But if you face it without fear, if you strip away its power, it can be beaten. The question is, Ellie, are you willing to face your worst nightmare?" Ellie felt her stomach churn, dread settling deep in her bones. She didn't know if she was ready to face what awaited her in the depths of her own mind. But she knew she didn't have a choice. Ellie hadn't slept for nearly 2 days. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her vision blurring at the edges as she drove through the winding back roads toward the old asylum on the outskirts of Brindle. Her heart pounded with each passing minute, her mind haunted by the scraping sound that had followed her through the dream, and by Dr. Fielding's words, "You have to face it head on." But how could she face something like the Night Stalker when the mere thought of falling asleep again filled her with a paralyzing fear? The asylum loomed ahead, a crumbling relic from a time long past. It had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and vines twisting through the cracks in the stone. Rumors had swirled for years about the place, about the patients who had disappeared without a trace, or worse, those who had been found, their bodies frozen in expressions of unspeakable horror. The asylum had a reputation as a place of lost hope, a sanctuary turned nightmare. It seemed like the only place left for Ellie now. As she parked in front of the rusted gates, a shiver ran down her spine. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it an eerie wail, like the voices of the forgotten souls who had once wandered the asylum's halls. For a moment, Ellie hesitated. The sun was setting behind a thick layer of clouds, casting a cold, gray light over the landscape. She knew that once darkness fell, the Night Stalker would be waiting, lurking in the corners of her mind, just out of reach until she closed her eyes. She pushed open the creaking gate and stepped inside. The asylum was worse up close. The walls were damp with mold, and the air was thick with decay. Inside, the narrow hallways twisted and turned, a maze of forgotten rooms and peeling paint. Every creak, every whisper of wind seemed to echo unnaturally, as if the building itself was alive, watching her. She found her way to what had once been the common area, now filled with broken furniture and shattered glass. It was there, among the ruins of this lost place, that she would try to make her stand. If there was anywhere she might face the Stalker, it was here, where the veil between reality and nightmare seemed paper-thin. Ellie set down her bag, her hands shaking as she pulled out a flashlight and a stack of notes she had taken from Dr. Fielding's office. His research had been scattered, disjointed, filled with half-finished theories and frenzied scrawls in the margins about how fear could be controlled, weaponized even in dreams. But none of it had been a clear path forward. There was no precise way to fight the creature. Only one message rang clear. You must not let fear rule you. Easy to say, she thought bitterly, her eyes scanning the decayed room. Her fear had been with her since the night she had first heard the name Night Stalker, growing with every sleepless hour. Now she was terrified of what would happen if she let herself slip into unconsciousness. But she couldn't run anymore. She couldn't stay awake forever. Ellie settled into one of the old, worn couches, her body aching with exhaustion. The shadows lengthened as the last light of the day faded, casting strange shapes against the walls. She kept the flashlight in her hand, gripping it tightly as though it could protect her from what was coming. Her eyelids grew heavy, and despite her efforts to fight it, she could feel the pull of sleep creeping in. Her head drooped, her breathing slowed. For a moment she jerked herself awake, panic flooding her veins. But there was no avoiding it. Sleep was inevitable. As her eyes fluttered shut, the world around her began to blur, the asylum's broken walls and crumbling floors fading into darkness. She was falling again, just as she had in her previous dreams, spiraling down into an abyss where the rules of reality no longer applied. Ellie landed on her feet this time, standing in the same long hallway she had seen before. The floor beneath her groaned as she took a step, the dim, flickering lights casting unsettling shadows against the walls. The scraping sound was there again, faint at first, but growing louder with every second. She knew what was coming. The Night Stalker was here. But this time, she didn't run. Her heart raced, and her instinct screamed at her to flee. But Ellie stood her ground. She remembered Fielding's words. It feeds on fear. She had to confront it, no matter how terrifying it was. The darkness at the end of the hallway began to shift. A shape emerged, a grotesque figure half hidden in shadow. Its body twisted unnaturally, long, clawed limbs dragging against the floor. Its eyes, black, hollow voids, locked onto her, and Ellie felt the suffocating weight of its presence. The Night Stalker paused, as though waiting for her to react, waiting for her fear to take over. Ellie's breath hitched, but she didn't move. She forced herself to stand tall, to meet its gaze, even as her entire body screamed to turn and run. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered, though her voice trembled. The creature didn't seem to respond, but the air around her grew colder, the shadows deepening. The thing lunged. Ellie's vision blurred as she prepared herself for the impact, but in the instant before it reached her, everything went black. She felt the weight of her fear slip away, like a distant echo. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the asylum, the night pressing in around her. The scraping sound had stopped, and the suffocating presence was gone. For now, Ellie awoke in the same tattered chair where she had drifted into sleep, the darkness of the asylum pressing heavily against the cracked windows. Her heart was still racing, her skin clammy with sweat. But the Stalker hadn't taken her. Not yet. She had faced it, stood her ground, but she knew deep down that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Night Stalker was still there, lurking in the shadows of her mind, waiting for the next moment of weakness. It hadn't fully revealed itself yet, and that was what terrified her most. It was playing with her, toying with the edges of her fear. She had only seen a glimpse of its true form in the dream, but Ellie knew there was more. And it was waiting for her to slip, for fear to sink its claws deep enough to pull her under. She stood, her legs weak beneath her, and paced the broken floor of the asylum's common room. Dr. Fielding's words echoed in her head. "You have to confront it head on. It knows your deepest fear." What did that mean? How could she fight something she barely understood? Something that knew her every vulnerability? Ellie walked toward a dusty mirror hanging crooked on the wall, its glass clouded with grime. Her reflection stared back, pale and exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes. She barely recognized herself, this worn-out version of her who had been running on adrenaline and terror for days. But there was something else in the reflection. Behind her, just out of focus, the shadows in the room seemed to shift and swirl. For a second, she thought it was just a trick of the dim light, but then the shape became clearer. A dark, twisting figure watching her from the far corner, its body almost blending into the shadows themselves. The Night Stalker was here, slipping between the veil of dream and reality. Ellie spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty. No sound, no movement, just the silent, crumbling walls of the old asylum. But the air felt heavier now, thick with a presence she couldn't see but could feel. It was always watching, always waiting. She couldn't stay here any longer. If the Stalker could reach her in waking life, it meant she had no safe place left. Not awake, not asleep. As she grabbed her coat, preparing to leave the asylum, the flicker of headlights caught her eye from the road outside. A car was approaching, its engine rumbling faintly in the distance. Ellie's pulse quickened. Someone was coming. Someone who might know more, or who might be in the same danger she was. The car rolled to a stop outside the gate, and a familiar figure stepped out. Dr. Fielding. His face was pale in the dim light, his movements hurried as he made his way toward the entrance. Ellie rushed to meet him. "Ellie!" he called out, his voice strained. "You're still alive, thank God!" She nodded, breathless. "It's here, isn't it? It's crossing into the real world." Fielding's expression darkened. "Yes. The more you resist, the stronger it gets. You've drawn it to you fully now. It's no longer confined to your dreams. It's found a way to reach you even when you're awake." Ellie felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. "Then how do I stop it? I've tried. I faced it in my dreams, but it's like it's waiting for something." Fielding's eyes flickered with something like pity. It's waiting for you to confront your deepest fear. Only then will it show its true form, and only then will you have a chance to defeat it. But if you falter, if you give in to fear even for a moment, it will take you. Ellie's mind raced. Her deepest fear. She had faced the Stalker in the dream, but it had felt like a shadow of the real thing, a fragment of something much worse. What was it truly after? What was her deepest fear? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, a low, rasping breath coming from behind them. Ellie's blood turned to ice as she slowly turned, and there, standing at the gate to the asylum, was the Night Stalker. This time it was no longer a shadow lurking in the distance. It was fully formed now, a towering figure with twisted, elongated limbs, its face a horrifying mask of featureless black, save for two hollow eyes that burned with a cold, soulless light. It moved slowly, deliberately, its claws scraping against the metal gate as it advanced toward them. The very ground seemed to tremble under its weight, and the air grew colder with each step it took. "Ellie," Fielding whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is it. You have to face it." The Stalker stopped just a few feet away, its dark form looming over them. Ellie's breath came in short, shallow gasps, but she forced herself to stand still, to meet its empty gaze. She could feel her fear bubbling up, threatening to consume her, but she held it back. And then in that moment, the truth hit her. It wasn't just the creature she was afraid of. It was the fear of losing control. Her entire life, Ellie had clung to the idea that if she could just keep control, nothing could harm her. But here, now, she was facing something she could not control, something that defied reason, and that was her deepest fear. With trembling hands, she stepped forward, her eyes locked on the Stalker. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she whispered, her voice growing steadier. "I can't control what happens next, and that's okay." The Night Stalker paused, its head tilting slightly, as if considering her words. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the creature's form began to waver, its dark, twisted limbs dissolving into mist, its hollow eyes flickering like dying embers. The cold grip of fear loosened around Ellie's chest as the Stalker slowly faded, its presence retreating into the shadows. And just like that, it was gone. Ellie collapsed to her knees, her body shaking with relief. Fielding was at her side in an instant, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You did it," he murmured. "You faced it." But as the darkness of the night pressed in around them, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that, while the Stalker was gone for now, it wasn't truly defeated. It never really was.